She took a key from her daughter's room. She drove through the dark streets of San Diego before sunrise. She let herself into the house that used to be hers. She climbed the stairs in the dark. She opened the bedroom door. And she shot them both. Her ex-husband, Daniel Broderick III, one of the most successful medical malpractice attorneys in San Diego, died in that bed. His new wife, Linda Kolkena, Broderick, 28 years old, married for 7 months, died in that bed. Betty Broderick turned herself in to police shortly after. She was convicted of second-degree murder in 1991. She was sentenced to 32 years to life in prison. She spent 35 years behind bars. She was denied parole 3 times. She never said she was sorry. And she died in prison on May 8th. And 2026, 78 years old, still insisting that what Dan Broderick did to her was the reason 2 people were dead. For more than 3 decades, America could not agree on Betty Broderick. Half the country called her a cold-blooded murderer. The other half called her a woman who was pushed past every human limit until she had nothing left. Today we are going to tell you the full story. Not the version that picks a side. The version that shows you everything and lets you decide for yourself. Because the truth of Betty Broderick is more complicated, more uncomfortable, and more important than either side wants to admit. Stay with me. Betty Broderick was not born into privilege. She was born Elizabeth Ann Bichelia on November 7, 1947 in Bronxville, New York, the third of 6 children in a strict, working-class Catholic family. Her father ran a plastering business. The household she grew up in was shaped by hard work, by Catholic values, by the belief that a woman's highest calling was to be a devoted wife and mother. Betty was bright and ambitious. She attended Maria Regina High School in Hartsdale, New York, and graduated from Eastchester High School in 1965. She earned a degree in early childhood education through an accelerated program at the College of Mount St. Vincent in the Bronx, picking up a minor in English along the way. She was 17 years old. She was accomplished. She had her whole life in front of her. And then she went to a football game at Notre Dame. That is where she met Dan Broderick. He was 21, a senior, about to attend Cornell Medical School. Handsome, funny, an ambitious Irish Catholic. Everything that Betty's upbringing had told her to look for in a man. He was, by her own account, magnetic. She later told the Los Angeles Times, "He was very ambitious, very intelligent, and very funny, and I am those 3 things. We were from the same kind of background." He wooed her through letters and telegrams. He moved to Manhattan to begin at Cornell. She followed him with her heart long before she followed him with her life. On April 12, 1969, Betty was 21 years old, they were married, and the deal they made, whether they fully understood it or not, was the deal that would eventually destroy everything. But here is the deal they made. Dan would pursue his education. Betty would support him. Not just emotionally, financially, practically, in every way that mattered. Dan completed his MD at Cornell in 1970. Then he announced he wanted to combine his medical degree with a law degree, and he enrolled at Harvard Law School. Betty was pregnant with their second child when they moved to Massachusetts. She gave birth to their daughter Lee in 1971. She later wrote in a 90-page account of her marriage, which she titled, "What's a Nice Girl to Do? A Story of White-Collar Domestic Violence in America," that she felt completely isolated during those years. "I went from being accomplished, well-connected and free to being isolated from family and friends, and trapped with 2 children for whom I was 100% responsible," she wrote. She worked, she sold Tupperware, she sold Avon products, she raised the children, she moved where Dan needed to move. She built her life entirely around his ambitions because that was the arrangement they had made, and Dan kept his end of the bargain, or so it seemed. He graduated from Harvard Law School in 1973. He was immediately hired by one of the largest law firms in San Diego. The family moved to La Jolla, one of the most exclusive coastal communities in California. By 1978, Dan left his firm and founded his own boutique practice specializing in medical malpractice litigation. He was brilliant at it. By the height of his career, Daniel Broderick III was earning $1 million a year. $1 million a year. The Brodericks belonged to country clubs. Their children attended private schools. They drove sports cars. They took ski vacations in Colorado. They were, in the words of a San Diego Union Society columnist, for picture perfect. Dan always looked straight from polo. Betty always wore Oscar de la Renta. They were the couple everyone pointed to and thought, that is what success looks like. That is what the life looks like. Betty Broderick had done everything she was supposed to do. She had supported a man from nothing. She had sacrificed her own ambitions. She had raised his children, built his home, sustained his social life, and stood beside him while he became everything he had promised to become. She was 35 years old. She was living in a mansion in La Jolla. She had 4 children she adored. And in 1983, her husband hired a new legal assistant, a 22-year-old former flight attendant. Oh, her name was Linda Kolkena. What happened next is the part of this story that has divided people for more than 40 years, because it depends entirely on who you believe. Betty's version: Dan began an affair with Linda Kolkena immediately. She confronted him in 1983. He denied it. He kept denying it for 2 years. He lied to her face over and over while continuing the relationship. He made her feel like she was paranoid, like she was unstable, like the problem was her emotional state, not his behavior. Dan's version, at least before his death, was that the marriage had been troubled for years, that Betty was volatile and difficult, that the relationship with Linda was complicated, and that by the time he finally admitted to the affair, the marriage was already broken beyond repair, or what is not disputed. In 1985, Dan Broderick filed for divorce, and what followed was not just the end of a marriage, it was, by virtually every account, one of the most brutal divorce proceedings in the history of San Diego County. For 4 years. 4 years of litigation. Dan was the president of the San Diego Bar Association. Betty later claimed he used his professional connections to make it nearly impossible for her to find legal representation. She cycled through 5 different lawyers. He was awarded sole custody of their 4 children. He was awarded the right to sell the family home. He controlled the financial settlement. Betty felt, and the evidence supports the feeling even if the law did not, that she was being systematically dismantled, stripped of her home, her children, her financial security, and the life she had spent 20 years building. She responded the way a person responds when they are losing everything and cannot find any other outlet. She left hundreds of profane messages on Dan's answering machine. She vandalized the family home, smashed mirrors, graffitied walls. She drove her car into the front door of his new house. Their children were inside. She was placed on a 3-day psychiatric hold. She later explained the phone messages. It was a reaction to hearing Linda's voice on the answering machine when she called to speak to her own sons. The restraining orders multiplied. The court appearances multiplied. The humiliations multiplied. Betty Broderick would later describe this period as white-collar domestic violence. A wealthy, illegally sophisticated husband using the system as a weapon against the woman who had made him wealthy enough to access that system in the first place. Whether you agree with that characterization, or whether you see a woman spiraling into dangerous instability, what is not in dispute is this. By 1989, the divorce was finalized. Dan had won almost everything, and Betty had been left with a financial settlement that she believed bore no relationship to what she had actually contributed to his success. On April 22, 1989, Dan Broderick married Linda Kolkena. Linda was so afraid of Betty that she urged Dan to wear a bulletproof vest at their wedding. He refused. 7 months later, Betty Broderick used her daughter's key to enter their home before dawn and shot them both in their bed. The morning of November 5th, 1989. Betty Broderick has told the story multiple times. The versions vary in their details. But the essential shape of what happened is this. She drove to Dan and Linda's house at 1041 Cypress Avenue in the Marston Hills neighborhood near Balboa Park. She let herself in. She climbed the stairs. She opened the bedroom door. She said she didn't intend to kill anyone. She said she had violent thoughts approaching the house. She said at the parole board in 2010, "I had one choice, to shoot them or myself. I couldn't let them win." She fired 5 shots from a Smith & Wesson revolver. Linda Kolkena was hit twice, once in the head, once in the chest. She died at the scene. Dan Broderick was hit once in the chest. He did not die immediately. He spoke to Betty briefly before he died. What he said, what she said back, is one of the details that has never been fully resolved in any public account of that morning. She then called her daughter Kim. She turned herself in to police. She was 41 years old. She would not see the outside of a prison for the rest of her life. The first trial began in 1990. It ended in a hung jury. The jury could not unanimously agree on whether Betty Broderick had committed first-degree murder, premeditated, deliberate, or second-degree murder, which does not require premeditation. But several jurors later said they believed her account of years of psychological abuse and manipulation made it impossible to convict her of the most serious charge. The second trial began on December 11th, 1991. This time the prosecution, led by Kerry Wells, presented Betty as a calculating woman who had planned the murders, who had purchased the gun 1 month before Dan and Linda's wedding, who had taken the key from her daughter with intent. The defense, led by Jack Early, argued that Betty Broderick was a woman who had been psychologically destroyed by years of manipulation, financial abuse, and the deliberate dismantling of everything she had built her life around. Betty took the stand in her own defense. She told the jury, "I bought into a 1950s Leave It to Beaver marriage, and he stole my whole life," she said. This was a desperate act of self-defense. She admitted firing the gun. She did not claim she hadn't done it. She claimed that what Dan Broderick had done to her for years before that morning was the reason it happened. The jury convicted her of 2 counts of second-degree murder. She was sentenced to 2 consecutive terms of 15 years to life. 32 years in total, plus 2 years for illegal use of a firearm. She looked at the sentence and said she had regrets, not remorse. "I regret my husband had no character. I regret my children lost their mother home instability. I didn't do the legal bullying. I wasn't the one who had the affair. I won't accept the blame for what happened. His was the white-collar way of beating you." She would say versions of those words for the next 35 years. The Betty Broderick case did not end with the conviction. In many ways, it was just beginning. Her story was immediately adapted into television. 2 TV movies aired in 1992 starring Meredith Baxter. They were watched by millions of Americans who were already deeply divided about what Betty Broderick represented. She was interviewed by Oprah Winfrey. She spoke publicly from prison, consistently and without apology, about what she believed Dan had done to her. She never wavered. She never softened. She never said sorry. And that refusal, that absolute consistent refusal to perform remorse, became the defining feature of her prison years. In 2010, her first parole hearing, all 4 of her children appeared. They were divided. 2 believed she should remain in prison. Her son, Dan, said his mother was a good person who had got lost along the way. But he warned, releasing a lost person into society could be a dangerous mistake. The parole board commissioner, Robert Doyle, told Betty Broderick something that cut to the heart of every hearing she would ever face. Your heart is still bitter and you are still angry. You show no significant progress in evolving. You are still back 20 years ago in that same mode. You've got to move on, Betty Broderick told the board. I allowed the voices in my head to completely take over. I took the lives of two wonderful people who were loved by many. And then, when pressed for the details of the shooting, she said, Linda came at me and the gun went off. Parole denied, for the maximum term possible, 15 years. In 2017, parole denied again. In 2021, parole denied a third time. Her next eligibility date had been set for 2032. She was 78 years old. She did not reach 2032. In 2020, 30 years after the murders, a new generation discovered Betty Broderick. The USA Network series, Dirty John, the Betty Broderick story, starred Amanda Peet as Betty and Christian Slater as Dan. It aired to enormous viewership and critical praise. Rotten Tomatoes called Amanda Peet's performance an incredible embodiment of a woman scorned. A generation that had not been alive in 1989 watched that series and reached the same division that America had reached in 1991. Some saw a murderer who had been given far too much sympathy. Some saw a woman whose story made them look differently at every marriage they knew. The youngest Broderick child, Rhett, appeared on Oprah and said something that stopped the audience. She's a nice lady. Everyone here would like her if they spoke with her on any topic other than my dad. Keeping her in prison isn't really helping her. She's not a danger to society. The only two people she was a danger to are dead. That statement has been quoted and debated in every conversation about Betty Broderick for the past 30 years. And it cuts to the exact tension that this case has always refused to resolve. Was Betty Broderick a danger? Was she a woman who had been pushed past every human limit? Or a woman who chose murder as the solution to a painful divorce? Was what Dan Broderick did to her a form of violence that the law simply had no language for in 1989? Or is none of that relevant to the fact that Linda Kolkena, Broderick, a 28-year-old woman who had not created Betty's marriage or destroyed it, was shot to death in her own bed on the 7th month of her marriage? Because here is the uncomfortable truth that this case has always demanded you sit with. Both things are true simultaneously. Dan Broderick's behaviour during that marriage and divorce was, by any reasonable reading, cruel, calculated and deliberately destructive. The way he used his professional power to disadvantage Betty in court. The years of denial about Linda, the custody arrangements, the financial settlement, the systematic dismantling of her identity and her life. None of that is invented. None of that is exaggerated. And none of it made Linda Kolkena Broderick deserve to die. Linda was 22 years old when she met Dan. She was 28 when she was shot in her own bed. She had a sister named Maggie who spent decades saying, "Nobody talks about Linda. It's always about Betty. But my sister is the one who is dead." Betty Broderick died on May 8, 2026. She died in the ICU of a medical facility outside the California Institution for Women, where she had been transferred in April after suffering a serious fall that broke her ribs and a series of septic infections. She was on life support at the end. She could not communicate. Her 4 children, Kim, Lee, Daniel and Rhett, were at her bedside when she died. She was 78 years old. She had spent 35 years in prison. She had been denied parole 3 times. She had never once said, not in the way the parole board required, not in the way that would have demonstrated the insight and remorse they were looking for across 3 decades of hearings, that she was sorry. She had regrets, never remorse. And that distinction, which Betty Broderick maintained with absolute consistency until she drew her last breath, is either the most honest thing about her, or the most damning, depending on who you ask. So let me ask you the question that Betty Broderick's life demands. Not whether she did it. She did it. She said so. Not whether it was legal. It wasn't. 12 jurors said so. The question is this: what do we do with a woman who has failed, systematically, deliberately, on and without legal remedy, and then failed everyone around her in the most final way possible? What do we do with a system that in 1989 had no language for what Dan Broderick did? The financial manipulation, the legal weaponization, the deliberate psychological erosion of a woman's entire identity, but had very clear language for what Betty did in response. What do we do with the fact that the woman who gave Dan Broderick everything he had, his education, his career, his status, his children, ended her life in a prison cell, while the story she built got sold as a TV series and debated in comment sections by people who will never experience anything close to what she experienced? And what do we do with Linda Kolkena, who is almost always the afterthought in this story, who was 28 years old, who did not deserve to die, and who has a sister who has spent 35 years saying, "Nobody remembers my sister"? There is no clean answer to any of those questions. There never was. That is why Betty Broderick's name trended on every platform the morning after she died. That is why America spent 35 years arguing about her. That is why this case, which started in a La Jolla bedroom before sunrise on November 5th, 1989, will be argued about long after the last person who was alive that morning is gone. Drop your answer in the comments. Was justice served when Betty Broderick died in that prison? Or did the justice system finish the job that Dan Broderick started in that courtroom in 1985? I want to know what you think. I read every single comment. If this is your first time on this channel, we are here every week for the stories that the world cannot stop arguing about. The women whose cases refuse to give us the clean ending we always think we want. Subscribe. And if this one kept you all the way to the end, that means everything.